is 9:01 here in Colorado Springs, which is 8 o'clock in California. And welcome everybody to our Redwood chapter monthly meeting here. And really want to welcome everybody on. And if we have any new members, please shout out. I'd like to welcome you personally. Any new members this time, or is everybody just familiar with the sound of my voice?
Charlie, I see a hand up.
I'm new. I'm in Sacramento, BMH Equipment. My name's Jack Alexander.
Jack, pleasure to have you on board here, and welcome.
Thank
to
you.
the Redwood chapter meeting.
And this is Ed Brathwaite. I'm new. I'm from Sharp Grossmont in San Diego, California.
Excellent. Ed, welcome.
Hi, I'm Charlene Boudreau with Health and Safety Compliance in Sacramento.
Wonderful. Good to see somebody there. Great.
And I'm James Perillo. I'm the San Diego president, and this looked interesting, so I'm glad I made it.
See, it wasn't just me, James. I appreciate that. Thank you.
This is Joe Rothman, also the Orange County chapter president. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Joe. Pleasure to have you.
I understand breakfast was being served.
It is. I have a nice warm cup of coffee right here, and you're welcome to some breakfast burritos in the next hallway. So
That's it.
Yes. All right. Well, that being said, I'll make one quick announcement here before I do the introduction, and I was going to let Tom start off. He has some great news of some upcoming.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Charlie. Hey, everybody, Tom Ruff from Granger, and we've been working with the San Francisco chapter on some content for one of their upcoming meetings on February 15th. That's February 15th at 8 a.m. I encourage you to check out the CSHI site for more details, but our topic is going to be around behavioral health assessments and compliance. We spent some time with Joint Commission Resources during our recent healthcare summit, and they gave us some really good insight into how Joint Commission is looking at behavioral health. We'll share some risk assessment tools and talk about how to do a virtual assessment in your environment of care.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom.
You're welcome.
Don't want to forget that we have our annual institute. It'll be announced here shortly. It'll be in June the 1st through June the 3rd, and in beautiful Lake Tahoe. So please kind of tentatively mark that on your calendar. I know I will, that's for sure. And it'll be just a fantastic annual institute. There's a lot of planning that's going into it, and for more details, just wait. More to come in about 2 to 3 weeks. So that being said, I do want to make sure I get full time available to Dr. Call, who is doing the presentation this morning. And Dr. Stephen Call is a professor at the School of Design and Construction in Washington State University. He's worked on hospital facilities cost benchmarking. And I want to welcome Dr. Call to start his presentation. Thank you, Dr. Call.
Thank you, Charles. Appreciate it. Yeah, really happy to be here. This is a topic that I've been researching for several years, and so really excited to share it with facility directors across the country. And a little bit, make sure little bit about me, a little more in depth about me. So. I actually have worked in the industry. So I just joined Washington State as a professor just a few years ago. So I've been a director of facilities for a medical center in Illinois, and I started my career at Texas Children's Hospital as a maintenance supervisor. So I've got the industry perspective of what it is that facility directors are dealing with in the world of healthcare, as well as the academic background to really provide some evidence-based solutions to some of these challenges, and at least kind of understanding the nuances. So as was mentioned, a professor at Washington State, live in Spokane, Washington. So here on the western side of the US. So I always enjoy getting to know folks in California and Oregon and Idaho and some of those other areas that where there's some proximity. You'll notice at the bottom of the screen, I can back up one more, a number of universities, ASU, UNC Charlotte, Washington State. So this research that goes on in the world of facilities management, it's a collaborative effort. Most universities don't have dedicated facility management programs, but every now and then there's a faculty member, and so we've all gotten together and started a group called Simplar, which is really focused on providing research to industries specifically. So if you ever see that logo Simplar, it's a collaboration of researchers that focus on facility management, which is pretty exciting. So most of you in the room, obviously being with ASHI, are familiar with healthcare. Every now and then I give presentations to those who aren't involved in healthcare, but just as a perspective of why my research. So my research is completely focused on healthcare facilities management. I'm one of a very few group that do that. And the reason I focus on healthcare is it is one of the largest industries in the US. 3.5 billion total spending. This is a little data, but 2017, 2018, $41 billion spent on construction. And not only is it large, but it's one of the fastest growing industries. So 15% job growth projected through 2029 as an example. So what this really says is the problems that we face in healthcare are big, and they're going to continue to get bigger because of just the growth that we're experiencing. So moving on specifically to kind of the benchmarking topic is what concerns are keeping hospital administrators up at night? So there was a study done by Deloitte several years ago that tried to answer this question. So the top four were changing Medicare reimbursements. Number 2 is transition to value-based care. Number 3 was improving margins. And number 4 was finding, recruiting, and retaining forward-thinking and adaptable healthcare leaders. So the majority of my research is actually focused on this idea of cost benchmarking, which really taps into this profit margin issue, and we'll talk a little bit more in depth on that today. And I do a lot on workforce planning, so on FM attrition, retention, succession planning. So that's another major focus of my research. So today we're really going to talk about how what we do as facility managers is impacting this issue of profit margins that's on the top of mind of healthcare CEOs. And may I also say, if you have any questions, feel free to just speak up as I progress through the presentation. You can submit a chat in the chat box. I'll take a look at that as well. If you want to save it towards the end of the presentation, we'll have some time for Q&A. So just kind of a reminder, when we say profit margin, so the only way to, quote, improve profit margin is do one of two things. It's either increase sales or decrease operating expense. And so, a little bit of basic finance there, but the reality is hospital facility managers are feeling pressure to reduce facility operating expenses because that's one of the two levers that the administrators can pull to help with profit margin. The challenge is that there's pressure to reduce operating expenses while still maintaining a high level of facility performance, which is causing a lot of strain and a lot of challenges within healthcare FM. And no secret to anybody on this call probably, but the facility expenses are a primary target for cost reduction because they're one of the largest cost centers for a hospital or medical center, and they're not revenue generating. So a lot of that, again, top 3 focus of a healthcare CEO is profit margins. One of the top focus is how do we cut costs? And the facility program is one of those major targets. So the question, kind of the research question really was, how can healthcare facility leaders effectively manage this increasing pressure to do more with less? Really, it comes down to making the business case. How do we make the case that we need this minimum amount of resources to deliver on expectations? So as I speak to healthcare facility leaders throughout the country, really it comes down to 2 key parts of this business case. Number 1 is the qualitative piece, it's still very important to tell the story of how facilities impact the quality of the healthcare experience. Talking about the brand, talking about the employee and patient satisfaction connections that come through the experience with the facility. That curb appeal, not only for patients, but also for employees. Most of you being from, I think, the Bay Area or the California market, the tech companies have really latched onto this to say, look, we understand that our human resources are the most important part of our business in many ways. And so creating a physical environment where they can recreate, where they can have childcare, where they can have meals, right? It's not something that's been fully adopted by the healthcare market by any means, but other organizations see that impact to facilities. And so we need to do a better job of kind of explaining or telling that story. Now, that's just the qualitative piece. It's very difficult to measure, but it's important. And now the quantitative piece. So tell the story of how facilities is impacting the finances of the healthcare business. So the reality is having a hospital is just the cost of doing business. So that's good. There's an underlying understanding that we need these healthcare facilities, and it's just a cost of doing business. So that baseline is there. Now, how do we measure that cost? In my opinion, the best way, the most accurate way is really measuring it through our CMMS programs. So measuring work demand, understanding what our hours of preventative maintenance are relative to the average amount of corrective work orders, understanding our backlogs, the number of labor hours we have to correct. So that's in a perfect world, that's the best way to do that. But it's very challenging. You have to have a robust system. You have to have a team of people that are really on top of that data. So it can be cumbersome, it can be challenging, and it's not the easiest thing to put into place. Also, we can talk about the risk of quantifying the risk of downtime. If a system were to fail, this would be the implications to the revenue, for example, of the hospital, the implications or the cost of deferred maintenance. So there's some ways to really tell the story of how facilities is impacting finances. However, the thing we're going to talk about today, or the method we're going to talk about today, is really benchmarking. What I love about benchmarking is it's a great starting point. It's fairly quick and it's fairly easy. These other methods are a little more cumbersome. Now, benchmarking is no silver bullet, but at least it gives you a quick, easy way to understand ballpark at minimum of where you're at within your facility costs compared to peers. So I really like benchmarking. I think it's a great imperative first step to really understanding this. So benchmarking steps. Step number one is developing and measuring internal processes and standards. In healthcare, that's typically not an issue. There are some organizations that I work with outside of healthcare where they don't even have good accounting systems. They're not even measuring their maintenance costs, right? So a lot of those issues aren't an issue within healthcare. So that's good. Typically, we know our utilization numbers, we know our gross square footage, right? So if you don't, that's the first step is organizing that data, starting to measure that data, and trying to benchmark internally. So this is nice if there's a health system with multiple facilities, we can start looking at these metrics by hospital within our same system. Once that's done, it's really important to start looking externally, to start comparing our internal data to peers. So internal benchmarking and then externally benchmarking. And then what this will do is identify gaps in performance. So it'll say, wow, I have 15 FTEs in my engineering department and other hospitals have 25 FTEs. So what's going on here? Now, again, a benchmark isn't going to tell you the story, that there's more work to be done to understand maybe the reason behind that, but it's a good first start. And it helps us really justify, it helps us justify our budget and forecast for the future. Once we've done some of those things, we can actually start initiating changes, performance improvements within our department. So even though most healthcare facility managers recognize the value of benchmarking, surprisingly, there's very few hospitals that actually do it. I won't take a poll today, but historically, I've found that less than 30% of hospitals are truly benchmarking. Some do. If they do say they do, they're only doing internally. So the question I've had is, well, why? If we've recognized the value of it, why is it not more common? It's fairly easy. It's a fairly good starting point. And so I'm going to talk through what I believe are some of the reasons. So some of the factors that are impacting the adoption or prevalence of benchmarking. The number one reason I believe is that the existing benchmarks that are currently available are dated. So the last true healthcare benchmark, and I'll put an asterisk to this because I'll talk about a new one that just came out, but prior to the new one that just came out, the Ifma and ASHI partnered in 2010 and produced a benchmarking report called O&M Benchmark for Healthcare Facilities. Most of you are probably pretty familiar with this. But again, that was 2010, so it was over 12 years old. The only metric they used was gross square feet and adjusted patient days. And when I say it's difficult, I like to read this. I like to read this paragraph. I get a good laugh out of it just because it's so confusing. It's kind of comical. But when you say, okay, we're using a metric of adjusted patient days. What does that mean? Well, adjusted patient day. This is a direct quote. Adjusted patient days is calculated by dividing total charges by inpatient charges, then multiplying by the number of inpatient days and admissions. Gross revenue divided by inpatient revenue times inpatient patient days equal adjusted patient days. Okay, so we can figure this out eventually, but it's overly complicated and cumbersome to be honest. So it's old, it's a little bit difficult to interpret, and it's not necessarily comprehensive. There's no facility salary data, for example, so you might be able to calculate what your FTE level should be, but you have no idea what compensation benchmarks are for your engineering staff, for example, which is a problem because somebody may be artificially lowering their FTE levels, but then outsourcing everything, for example. So those two numbers are really, really important, and that benchmark doesn't have that data. I put IBM Action OI down here. I didn't want to put it in writing, but the reality is that's typically the benchmark that executives are using because that's a pretty robust benchmark that is capturing quite a bit of healthcare data, not just facilities. And that's typically the benchmark. We were talking a little bit earlier before the meeting started about, when somebody approaches a facilities director and says, hey, I have some benchmarks, we all kind of freeze up because we know what's going to be coming. It's going to be saying, you're overstaffed or you're spending too much on utilities. What I will tell you is that IBM Action OI data, for some reason, so I just not too long ago finished a large staffing benchmarking study for the VA system. And I actually purchased the rights to use some of that Action OI data to compare the VA system. And it is grossly under what I would say should be normal for a facilities department. And I'm saying, close to 50% below what is normal. I don't know why. I tried to figure out, okay, is it missing some certain functions? What's going on? I couldn't quite figure it out, but just be aware that, if that's the data set, you're going to be, the data is going to be showing that you're overstaffed, for example. The good news is there is a new benchmark. Ifma, I actually helped support this new effort, but Ifma just published a new benchmark in 2020 that was a follow-up to the 2010 report that was partnered with ASHI. Ifma has done a really poor job of marketing this, but it's there, and that's one of the reasons why I like to share this presentation because healthcare facility directors are typically unaware of this new report. There are some deficiencies with that one still, but it's updated data, a pretty robust data set of hundreds of hospitals across the US, and it's a good source. However, with any benchmark, there's limitations. And this is usually the pushback I get a lot as well, where it's, I'm not going to benchmark because of one of these 5 things. For example, it's not fair to compare my rural system to the urban system, or that facility has, they have more geographically spread clinics, and ours is more of a true kind of central medical center. So yes, there's always going to be some challenges with peer comparison equivalence, is what I call that. So we have to be mindful of that. Ratiometric comparison equivalence is another way of saying the different measurement standards for built, like, for example, gross square footage. We all know if we gave everybody an exercise to go measure the gross square footage of a room, we'd all come back with different numbers. And so even the ratios can be a little bit challenging. Limited insight into factors contributing to peer performance. So another way to look at that is, as I mentioned, well, maybe somebody's outsourcing their trades, and so their FTE levels are low, but they're outsourcing their trades. We don't have a lot of insight into that, or facilities staff performing construction, for example. So maybe your facility size is a little bit larger because you're doing other things, other functions within your staff that other peer hospitals aren't doing. So that can create some heartburn as well. And then best practice is invalid if the overall industry is facing similar challenges. So if the whole healthcare industry is facing staff level shortage for skilled workforce, for example, which is a real phenomenon happening right now, the best practice is still not ideal. So that needs to be considered. And then lastly, self-reporting. At the end of the day, most of this data that's coming for these benchmarks is self-reported. So how accurate that is always to be debated. So these are real concerns. They're real limitations. That this is sometimes what I hear about why healthcare organizations just don't benchmark. But what I would say to this is, yes, there are limitations. Yes, we need to be aware of these, but that shouldn't stop us from benchmarking, because it is such a good first step to understand if we're in the ballpark or not.
If I could add too, the tracers that we do in the hospitals is another good way of benchmarking, especially if you're in a big, healthcare system. In San Diego, Sharp owns 4 hospitals, and then of course the medical buildings. But as a group, we're trying to do more of a look at how we all do the processes within the hospital, so that we're all standardized throughout the organization instead of each hospital doing their own thing. So it's kind of part of the high reliability organization concept, and we're still working on it, obviously, but at least we've got the ball rolling.
Yeah,
but that's another issue.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, and that's key, and that's kind of that first step of that internal benchmarking.
Yeah.
You would hate to say, well, this I think it's Sharp. You mentioned this Sharp hospital. We do things differently, and so you're comparing apples to oranges sometimes. You don't want that, and so internally it's a lot easier to say, okay, well, we're all going to do it this way, or we're all going to measure it this way. When you're comparing to an external peer, you don't quite have that opportunity. So that's why you have to be really skeptical and say, well, yeah, so that benchmark is saying that I'm understaffed or overstaffed, but is it because of X, Y, or Z, the different process, the different way they, what is considered, plant operations may include construction, might include security, right? And so you have to be skeptical, but as you mentioned, Ed, it's still very valuable. We don't want to throw the whole thing away because there's some challenges. So thanks for that feedback. So the traditional approach to benchmarking is typically a ratio. So for example, electricity expense per gross square foot. So on average, this is fairly realistic data. On average, hospitals spend about $2 on electricity for every 1 gross square feet. So that's a ratio of 2 to 1. Pretty basic. So a perfect correlation would be if every hospital spent $2 per 1 gross square foot. But the reality is we know that there are other factors that are affecting a hospital's electricity expense. For example, the location. So a hospital in San Francisco versus a hospital in Anchorage, Alaska. The locations are different. A hospital that's 5 years old, that's LEED accredited versus a 100-year-old hospital in New England that's barely, it has 5 phases and it's barely hanging together. Okay, that's obviously going to affect your electricity consumption, the type of equipment that's pulling power in that facility, et cetera, et cetera. So these traditional approaches, well, it's an average, right? On average, but there's some other things or other factors that are affecting you hospital by hospital, those numbers. So the question that really has come to my mind is there a better metric? This is another thing that I hear a lot is it's unfair to use gross square foot as a metric in hospitals. It might work in other facilities, a business occupancy, for example, where it's pretty standard, the same process, the same type of space on each building. Is there a better metric besides gross square foot to determine electricity expense that actually holds its ratio, irrespective of other factors? So a little quick tutorial on correlation. So when I say holding its ratio would mean regardless of anything else, regardless of location, regardless of infrastructure age, regardless of anything, a perfect correlation would be every single hospital is on a 2-to-1 ratio. So a perfect correlation, you can see, let's assume this is a 2-to-1, a rise of 2-to-1, right? And these little dots or these little X's are actual data points for hospitals. So you can see those dots are very, very closely aligned with that true slope. On a perfect correlation, all those X's would be right on that line. That would be a perfect correlation. But what it's saying is, well, in general, there's a strong correlation, strong positive correlation. And then if you look to the far right, that's where there's no correlation at all. This would be an example of to say, well, our electricity expense per number of pine trees in our landscaping, right? There's no correlation to that. So, however, there are some metrics. It's ridiculous to say electricity per number of pine trees, but we sometimes use metrics that we don't really understand the correlations. So the other thing to remember is correlation coefficients. So if there's a perfect correlation, it's going to be 1. If there is a weak or 0 correlation coefficient, it's going to be 0. Anything above 0.5 is considered strong, either negative or positive. So that's the correlation coefficient. Why this is important, because in here in a minute, I'll skip ahead. I did some statistical analysis to say, what is the correlation coefficient between various utilization metrics like beds, patient days, admissions, gross square feet, plant property and equipment values? Is there a strong correlation between these utilization metrics and plant operating costs or EVS costs? So we'll come back and look at these numbers, but that's what I was trying to determine. So the methodology behind this recent research was looking at utilization reports and looking at financial statements for every state's Department of Health, which is many times published. And what was determined is the most common healthcare utilization metric, which is no surprise, are admissions, discharges, available and licensed beds, patient days, and gross square feet. Those are the most commonly available utilization metrics, hospital utilization metrics. The other metric that I thought this would be really interesting to see if there's a correlation is plant, property, and equipment values, which is a value on a corporation's or hospital's balance sheet. So that's not technically a utilization metric, but it is a financial metric that was looked at. So you can see the most common healthcare utilization metrics by state are pretty evenly published, except gross square feet. Very, very few hospitals actually publish their, even though it's, as a facility director, that's probably the most common metric that we use. It's not the most commonly published. So when you look at when you look at available hospital metrics and hospital cost information, three things that were attempted. Attempted to verify if gross square feet, if it was a sound metric for hospital facility benchmarking, number one. Explore the strengths of other metrics besides gross square feet, and then breaking it out by large and small hospitals to see, was there a difference between those correlation strengths between large and small? And when I say large, it's not, or anything greater than 100,000 square feet is really where the shift took place. So anything greater than 100,000 square feet, gross square feet, was considered a large hospital. So what the data showed is, you can see here from this graph, hopefully it's not too small on your screen, that total plant operating expense, and then here are the sub costs. So maintenance, utilities, salaries, depreciation expense, and other, those are all roll-up costs to the total plant costs. And then in EVS, there was 3 roll-up costs that went into the total. So for a large hospital, what this is saying is that really you can use any of these metrics and you're going to have a strong correlation to your plant expenses on a high level. Now, if you start trying to divvy these up on the sub costs, sometimes the correlation drops. But the key finding is to just know, for a large hospital, whether you're looking at beds, patient days, admissions, gross square feet, PP&E, those are all good metrics, strong metrics. The real shift happens when you look at smaller hospitals. You'll notice that all of a sudden those, if it's below 0.5, it means it's really not, there's not a good correlation. There's not a good strength of connection between cost and utilization. So for small hospitals, the only 2 metrics that are greater than 5 are admissions and plant, property, and equipment values. So what this is telling me is that if I'm just thinking, what's the best metrics to use regardless of hospital size, it's admissions and PP&E values. So the PP&E has not historically been a key metric for benchmarking facilities in the past, but the paper that I just published based on this research is saying this is a key indicator to do that. Ifma, on their new 2020 report, kind of accepted that research point and added that into their research on some of their metrics. So I'll stop here for a moment and ask if there's any questions about the research, about the correlation coefficients. Any questions at this point?
Dr. Call, this is Charlie. I wondered, how did you determine what would be a large and small hospital? I know you looked at the number of square footage, but a lot of times we've seen in the data they looked at the number of beds.
Mm-hmm. When you looked at the data, that's where the break off happened, was right around that 100,000 square feet number. Honestly, I could probably go back and look. I just don't have it on the top of my head. And when I say, you could say, okay, well, that's equivalent to X number of beds or X number of square feet. So I just use gross square footage just for a talking point, but I'm sure there's a specific bed count where I would consider large or small as well. So good point. And I can get that information for you. I just don't have it off the top of my head. And I don't remember what that was. And that's why I say to keep it simple, right? My whole goal in this was say, is there a simple, easy way to benchmark? We don't have to do adjusted patient days. It's just, no matter what size our hospital is, just use PP&E or admissions. That should be your default. If you don't have that data easily, then yeah, you can do gross square feet. But what this is saying is, in other words, admissions, for example. So it's saying if it was 1, it would tell us that regardless of any other factors, location, age of facility, type of facility, mix of occupancy, if it was 1.0, it would say nothing else matters. Admissions has a perfect correlation coefficient. So what this is telling us is that only 28%, there's only 28% of this data is, or these other factors are contributing to any changes in the plant operating expenses. So it's saying it's a very, very strong metric. In other words, when you look at, patient days, for example, this is saying, look, there's 76% of other things going on that are attributing to the total plant operating expense. So that's not a good metric. And really the only two that we would feel, confident in on a small hospital would be admissions or PP&E. On a large hospital, they're all strong. But to keep it really simple, I say use PP&E or use admissions. Those are the metrics that are going to hold strongest for you. Thanks, Charles, for that. Well, let's I already mentioned this, but kind of the key findings here is gross square foot is really not a very reliable metric for small hospitals. The best metric for facility cost benchmarking is plant property and equipment and admissions. Those are the key metrics that you really want to use. Not to say that gross square foot is worthless, because it's still a good metric. And personally, when I do benchmarking, I do a lot of benchmarking analysis and support for other for systems across the US in this. I like to use all of them. And so I will provide, calculate a benchmark based on all of the utilization information, and then look at more of the median, giving preference to PP&E admissions, but then looking at kind of a median range. That's really helpful. So this is an example of the actual ratio. So what this is saying, this is showing correlation coefficients. This is showing what the actual ratio is. So for plant property and equipment, the ratio is 0.036. For total OpEx, for every one admission in a hospital, they should spend $1,217 on plant operations total. For every 1 gross square foot, they should spend $21.81. For every 1 available bed, they should spend $57,911, so on and so forth. So it's really easy. You just say, okay, well, what's my annual admission, multiply that by 1217, poof, there's your total plant operations expense. Just keep in mind that total OpEx that I'm showing includes the roll-up costs of depreciation expense, compensation, utilities, purchase services. So the thing you have to keep in mind, especially with depreciation expense, if you're not including it, you need to make sure you include that in your total, or your calculations will be off. Many times we don't think about that depreciation expense, but that's included. So an example of this, for every $1 of PP&E, the average medical center expends $0.036 on plant op. So if a hospital has PP&E values of 350 million, they should spend approximately $12.6 million annually on plant operations. So the formula is 350 million times 0.036 equals 12.6 million. So I would love if you, I think some of you might be quickly, writing down those formulas to see. Maybe I'll pause for maybe 30 seconds. And most of you probably don't, off the top of your head, don't know your PP&E values. That's usually a number you're going to have to get from accounting. And the other thing to keep in mind, that's gross PP&E. There's typically gross and net. So you really want to be careful you're getting the gross PP&E. But most of you probably know your admissions. So maybe I'll take 20 seconds and have you calculate that. So your total plant ops, if calculate that your annual admissions times 1,217, how does that, I'm curious to know if you all say, wow, that's right on, or I'm low or I'm high. Any thoughts on that number from anybody that maybe did some quick calculations? That's okay if you don't want to share.
Dr. Call, I was going to say,
Yeah.
you want to just give them another quick example of what the PP&E is, how they calculate that?
Well, so the plant, property, and equipment values is the value that's on your hospital's balance sheet. So most of you probably don't know that off the top of your head. That's something you'll have to get from accounting. But so the easiest thing to do would be, for example, okay, we can even go back to gross square feet. We all know our gross square footage. That's something we think about a lot. And that's $21.81. So what's the total gross square footage for your medical center? Multiply that by 2181. And that would be the benchmark for your total plant operating expenses. So I'll come back to that maybe at the end if anybody has any thoughts on that. But so 2181 is the metric or the ratio. Multiply that by your gross square footage. Keep in mind that this data set is looking at medical centers, so it's not just your hospital. And there is going to be some variance, right? Because some organizations have the cost center for facilities is including outside clinics. So that's all part of it. So there is going to be some differences probably, but that's kind of the benchmark is a medical center with a hospital, a couple of outpatient buildings, and maybe a couple of geographically spread clinics, for example. All right, so moving on.
Dr. Call, I was going to mention
Yeah.
one thing. When we look at depreciation, a lot of facility managers do not have that data. It's kind of been taken out of their budget because
Yep.
it's not something they can control. So it may definitely be something they'd have to reach back to the CFO to get.
Absolutely, yeah. So you would, and frankly, I haven't shown you, but on the table that I have, you can calculate the subtotal. So instead of trying to do the total plant ops, and you can go, let's go to a large hospital. This not showing you my slide isn't showing you the actual ratio, but you could go to you say, okay, well, I know my maintenance, but really all I care to know is my maintenance, utilities, and salaries. And then you could just do the ratios based on those three sub costs and take out depreciation and some of those things. So it's not that hard to do. But if you wanted to just check your total, just be aware that total number based on that ratio of 2181 is including depreciation expense. And that's typically not a number that we have in mind, but it's definitely, you're going to see that on your budget, obviously. Yeah. Going back to the question, how can healthcare facility leaders effectively manage increasing pressure to do more with less? Benchmark, that's the first step. I wanted to mention something that's also quite fascinating, in my opinion, that is a new way of looking at this. But construction work in progress. So construction work in progress is the amount that accounting is adding to the balance sheet for costs that have been incurred for construction projects that have not yet received the occupancy permit. Once that occupancy permit is achieved, then it shifts, that construction work in project total shifts over to true PP&E value. So all construction work in progress is PP&E value that's not yet in service. So it has the same correlation, the same ratios. So what's fascinating about this is if you think PP&E ratios can predict future facility operating expenses for buildings under construction or even prior to design and approval phase. So if you know what your total construction costs, you got to be careful because it's not just construction, right? It's the equipment, it's the furniture, everything that's going into that project. If you have a budget early on in the project, even before it's approved, you can use these ratios. You can use this PP&E ratio to actually calculate what your annual operating expenses will be. So that's quite helpful especially for a facilities director to say, hey, we're proposing this new building, but is it am I going to get a sufficient budget to operate it? So that's a really important finding in this research that this PP&E ratio can be used for. So when I share this presentation, usually it's the architects that get quite excited about this as well, because when the whole value engineering process is ongoing, they can actually show, hey, not only can we, if we make some value engineering changes, will it affect the capital budget, but we can show that these changes, how they're affecting your operating budget, whether you project that out 20, 30 years. So this is a really, really powerful tool that can be used in the design and construction and pre-approval phase of capital planning. Any questions on that?
So you're saying if you calculate it, it'll be in addition to, right? Or you're trying to calculate it for the whole, as a whole, the new operating budget.
Yeah. So you've got a building that's being designed that hasn't, maybe even been approved yet, and you can already know what your annual operating expenses should be on that building. And how those operating budgets are generated varies, or if they even do that. So you can know, hey, when that building comes online, you can also calculate your FTEs. Say, I need an extra 6 FTEs based off of these ratios, instead of just saying, well, we'll open up and we'll kind of see how it goes. You don't have to do that anymore. You can say, based off of these PP&E ratios, I can predict what my staffing levels will be. I can predict what my utilities will be. I can predict what my maintenance costs will be, and so that you can be prepared to maybe even push back on some of those budgets that you're given, because you may be told, look, you'll get an extra 2 FTEs, but the benchmark is showing you should have 7. It's just now some information that you can have to make your business case of why you need more employees or why you need additional resources. Great. So in summary, again, next step is just gathering existing facility cost information. If you want to know your PP&E values, for example, just reach out to your accounting department. I promise they can provide that to you. Remember, just keep in mind that's gross PP&E. And then compare benchmarks. Internally, obviously, is great, but externally is really where you see the value. It will help you justify your existing budgets, number one. Many of you, as I mentioned, are feeling pressure, or over the years, that budget has been chipped away over time, and you look back now and you're like, oh man, I'm running so thin. It'll help you justify those existing budgets, and it'll help you identify gaps where some forecasting can be done to help grow that budget. And at the end of the day, the benchmarking is just providing the evidence for you to build these business cases, to justify extra FTEs, to justify additional budget. In the rare, sometimes it might show that you're overstaffed, and that's always the risk of benchmarking. But either somebody's going to benchmark for you, or you can be proactive and benchmark and be transparent with your administration of where you're at. So that's the end of the presentation. I would love to field any questions or comments anybody might have that's on the call.
Well, Dr. Call, first off, I definitely want to thank you for the presentation. Very, very enlightening. And I'm running through all the numbers in my head as well. I'm sure as everybody else is. you know, a lot of times a facility manager gets, you know, told that they've got this new building that's coming on board, and, you know, they don't need staff because it's brand new. You don't need to maintain it, right? So, but that being said, I think it's a great tool to have up front and be able to be part of the planning, you know, with administration as new buildings are even thought of. And I know Jeff Miller's been working on some additions there as well in Santa Rosa, so I'm sure he's got some pretty good insight to it. But again, looking at these benchmarks, it's important that we have more than just allowing administration just to come up with new benchmarks from the latest, greatest consultant that comes in and says they need to cut staff, right? So I think this is a good part for us. I'll open it up. Does any other members have any questions you'd like to present?
I just got a question on the chat feature from Greg. He asked, what was the makeup of data set in these numbers? Are there any regional differences? Great question. The Ifma data for 2020 was across the US, so it was geographically quite spread. The data specific to the PP&E research was actually kind of West Coast, so it was Washington and Oregon primarily. So, you know, keep that in mind. But there was several, 150 hospitals or so. So there's some confidence that those numbers will carry across regardless of geography. But yeah, great question. I'll also mention, that new Ifma report, you can go download that. I think it's a few $100s to have access to that report. I also, if you have any questions, would like any support, you can contact me. Change this, my number's there. My email's there, steven.call1@wsu.edu. If you have any questions, love to provide any support you might need. So appreciate the opportunity to present today.
Stephen, do you have anywhere the paper that you gathered or that you did this research? Is it published anywhere?
It's been submitted to a peer-reviewed journal, but it hasn't been published yet. So as soon as that happens, I'm happy to share that. Those take quite a long time. Honestly, it takes 6 to 12 months before that is published. But if you're interested in kind of having kind of the cliff notes of some of the key data points, send me an email. I'm happy to share some of the information with you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Paul.
All right. Well, we're right up on the hour. Definitely want to thank you again. Any other questions? Just kind of your last shot, to come out there.
I'd like to ask a question.
Please.
So I've got a very selfish interest in helping healthcare, specifically in, I sell wheels and casters, among other things. And I've been always interested in HCAHPS and how they affect the bottom line of hospitals, and who within the healthcare industry uses that as part of their benchmarking or their income or reason for making decisions.
Well, so I apologize, Jack. When you say HCAHPS, I'm not familiar with that.
So there's a questionnaire that goes out to Medicare patients. It has a series of questions. The one that's meaningful to me is the quietness of a hospital. I can make any piece of equipment absolutely silent by putting expensive, marvelous wheels on it. Mm-hmm. So that's the selfish part of it. I would do this for fun because I love healthcare and I like fixing stuff. But this has just been an ongoing question in my mind, is how it works into the real day-to-day engineers and PO&M and all the guys that twist wrenches.
Well, I can't maybe speak to how that data is used on the ground. I've been a facility director, but it's been 15 years or so since I've been in healthcare FM. It would be interesting to try to see if there is any correlation between the responses to that and the profit margin of the hospital, or whatever metric, right? You would try to say that there is some statistically significant benefit when someone is answering that question. So I haven't looked into that, but that kind of, there has been some thoughts in my mind about, I'm familiar with like the Press Ganey type surveys that your question, how clean is how clean was your room? How, what was your experience with your maintenance staff, right? So those are some of the questions. Do those responses have a statistically significant impact on the hospital, whether that's financially or whatever it might be? So good question. I don't think anybody's ever looked into that, but I'd love to hear from you. Send me an email. Maybe we could connect and see if there's some research opportunity there.
Will this recording be available to us?
Yes, this recording will be posted on the CSU website.
Thanks, Beth.
So another question, McGray, has anyone looked at total FM spend versus total operating budget ratio correlation? It seems to hold in biomed. Total operating budget, total FM spend versus total operating budget. So maybe, Greg, you can unmute and clarify. Are you talking when you say total facilities, are you including like a dietary, EVS, biomed? When you say total FM spend, is that what you're saying?
Actually, just throwing it out there. I know in my clinical engineering circles, they have shown that there's a high correlation factor between the clinical engineering total expense versus the hospital's total budget. So I haven't really given it much thought beyond just, your presentation, and it's getting my gears spinning.
Yeah. Well, and maybe I'm simplifying this too much, but I would agree. You're spending more on biomed, you're probably going to spend more on total facilities. Is that?
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, I don't know. I've seen some data sets from at some other conferences where, at least for the clinical engineering subset, it holds pretty tight around 1.1% and a high correlation factor.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay, so what you're saying is to understand your biomed budget, if you know your total FM spend, you can use that as like some type of ratio to say, this is what you spend on biomed based on your overall FM spend.
Yeah, actually that metric was independent of FN. It was just carved out for the biomed or clinical engineering metrics. So okay. Yeah, so I was just curious, maybe a roll up of, all of those spends, yeah. Let's say whatever you wanted to group together, Steve, into a number, and then compare and see if there's correlation that way.
Yeah, and I don't know the answer to that. The challenge is finding that detailed cost information on a wide enough level that you can actually do some statistical testing is challenging.
Agreed.
But if that's send me an email. I'd love to maybe chat with you. If you have a question specific to your system, that's usually what I end up doing. If there's questions within a system, I can usually get into the weeds of their financials because I have access to that data then. But good question. Yeah, I don't know the answer to it, but it'd be interesting to look into it for sure.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Steve.
Thank you.
Great discussion. Is there any other questions that we have? I know that we looked at patient days, looking at correlations and everything else going through their admissions. I think Dr. Call, I think you've done an amazing job on this, putting the benchmark together, looking at it in a different perspective, utilizing the data set, from Ifma. I mean, it's perfect. It really is timely. One last shout out. Just wanted to remind everybody, of course, that the annual institute is on June 1st, June 3rd. We'll hear more about it. It's in Lake Tahoe. And you never know, we might be able to get Dr. Call to come up and spend some time in Tahoe or something.
Any excuse I can come to Tahoe, yeah. Sign me in.
Hey, Charlie, can I just put out again for anybody who joined us late on February 15, the San Francisco chapter is having a presentation on behavioral health that Granger is going to support. We're going to provide some information on audits, Joint Commission assessments, and help you do some safety assessments in your facilities.
Great. Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it. Beth, did you have any last minute housekeeping there we need to take care of?
No, I don't think so. I think you covered it all.
Okay, well, good deal. I appreciate everybody's attendance today, and thank you very much. And thank you especially to Dr. Stephen Call, and look forward to hearing more from you soon.
Thank you very much. Take care, everybody.
All right, thank you.
Great
Bye now.
presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks, my friends. All right. Bye-bye.